There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. From Mamamia, you're listening to No Filter, and I'm Mia Friedman. There's this thing that often happens when you break up with someone that you really loved and were with for a long time. You feel the need for a change, a physical change somehow, like getting a fringe or dyeing your hair. There's something about putting some physical distance between your newly single self and the person that you were with them. Some people, though, go to a different kind of extreme after a breakup. When Sophie Matterson was 31, her relationship with her long-term boyfriend ended. And soon afterwards, she packed up all her belongings into saddlebags and decided to trek from Shark Bay in West Australia to Byron Bay on the east coast. Well, not all her belongings, obviously. She didn't take furniture, but she did take 5 camels. 5 camels. This was a little bit less random than it sounds. Sophie did have experience with camels. She'd worked at a camel dairy for years. Who knew that camels made milk? She loved the animals, which is apparently pretty unusual because camels can be very cranky. They spit. But that didn't deter Sophie. Unlike her mates in their early 30s who were getting engaged and starting families, Sophie wanted an adventure. So for 13 months in 2020, Sophie walked across Australia with her camels: Jude, Delilah, Charlie, Clayton and Mac. She'd often walk for weeks without seeing another soul. She crossed deserts, salt lakes and passed through cattle stations. Things got pretty tough and pretty wild along the way. And on this episode of No Filter, Mamamia's Claire Murphy sits down with Sophie to talk about her extraordinary story.
Talk me through the experience of the first time you ever met a camel.
Yes, it's still very, very clear actually in my head. Obviously, I'd travelled overseas and I'd seen other camels overseas, but I'd never really had any one-on-one contact with camels. I didn't really know anything about them until I went to work at a camel dairy. It was a friend of mine who I'd gone to school with. It was her auntie owned this camel dairy on the Sunshine Coast. And I heard about that and I thought, I really want to go meet camels. I've never met a camel before. And I'd grown up with horses, so, I'd always been an animal person. And I went to meet these camels at the dairy, and there was about 50 or so camels in this yard. And I stepped into the paddock with Lauren Brisbane, who owned the camel dairy, and all of these camels crowded around me. And they're massive animals, camels as well. So they can be quite intimidating because they tower right over the top of you and they have these huge long necks, and they brought their necks down to me. And camels are not like a dog. You don't stretch out your hand and they want to sniff your hand. Camels like to get to know you face to face. So they all brought their heads right into me and they gave me this long, long smell with their nostrils right touching my face. And it was a most amazing experience. It was a real, I sort of almost describe it as a bit of a reading of my soul. It was like they were really getting to know who I was, what I was about, how I was feeling, what my intentions were. And yeah, it stuck with me, that moment.
So from that initial experience, what then led you to go work at an outback station where they had wild camels?
I just sort of fell into camels.
That's a very weird statement.
I know it must sound like a very odd statement, but it was never sort of a goal of mine from growing up to walk across Australia with camels. It was sort of a strange series of events, I guess, that led me down this weird and wonderful path. And yeah, like I was saying, the camel dairy just so happened that it was a great friend's auntie. So that was the sort of weird turn of events that led me there. And from that meeting, I was just so hooked on them. It was like I'd suddenly found this intense passion and curiosity, I guess, and so kept wanting to extend my knowledge more and more with camels, and that led me to, going to work first in the Flinders with camels and then all the way to Uluru, and that's where I'd sort of started to realise that I wanted to do the trek. across the country. I'd sort of heard about other people doing treks. Obviously, Robert Davidson's very famous. And so, yeah, I'd started to come up with the concept that I wanted to do my own. And I knew that Uluru was going to be the best place to sort of be able to make that happen for me. Chris Hill, who I went to work with there, he mustered camels from the wild for his treks. And I thought, this will be the perfect place to get my own wild camels and to start training them.
Now, as you write your book, you talk about the journey that gets you to this point, but also your life with camels is partnered with your life with humans, obviously, your relationships happening behind the scenes. You've got a dad who is worried about his daughter being out there with camels in the middle of nowhere. You've got a boyfriend at the time, Sam, who you talk about as being like someone who is very influential on you and who has actually like really left an indelible mark on you as a person as you've grown and kind of set out on this journey. But you've also got this love of camels that takes you really far away from them all the time. How did they deal with you always feeling that draw to go back out and work with the camels out in the middle of nowhere at times?
Yeah, it was really, I guess, this push-pull because, Sam and I loved the outdoors. We were always out hiking together. And it was in some ways, it was sort of Sam that inspired that within me. He led me to that love of hiking and adventuring and so on. And this passion grew in me to want to do that more and more. And then when the camels came along, it kind of was like, oh, cool, I could do this with camels and how adventurous that would be. I could go trekking with the camels. But then, unfortunately, like you said, that then, of course, started to lead me further and further away from Sam. And they're an animal that belongs in remote places. And so it took me to remote places and I was spending longer and longer times away from Sam, and that was becoming more and more strained because of that.
He's also spent time away from you too because he was in the army, right? So a lot of your relationship has been spent away from each other. Did you at any stage think that it was ever going to be too much?
Now when I look back on it, I sort of think, wasn't that obvious? Wasn't it obvious that I was putting such a strain on the relationship? But I guess at the time I just thought, it'll be all right. I just hoped for the best. And we just seem to have this unlucky knack of constantly our timings never meeting up. Sam went to Iraq when I was back home, and then I would go off and do a camel thing once he had come back from Iraq. And it was just this constant, never matching up time-wise. And I was at this point in my life where I'd sort of never really found something that I was totally passionate about and totally focused on. And it was like the camels had all of a sudden provided this huge focus and drive and passion, and I had started working towards this goal. And maybe that goal in a way sort of blindsided me to a relationship that was starting to fall apart right in front of my eyes, I guess. So, it was a sort of a sad turn of events, really.
So when you were starting to consider this walk across the country with your camels, were you initially planning it with Sam in mind, that he would join you on that adventure?
Yeah, I was. I'd hoped that, to be honest. I had hoped because we had both loved adventuring together that he would suddenly sort of find this love of camels with me. But I think it was tricky. I think Sam was he was about to leave the army, and he was going through his own sort of, who am I after the army and what do I want to do with my life? And I'd sort of was in some ways trying to sort of force the camels onto him, and slowly started to realize that, that wasn't his passion. It wasn't his passion like it was mine. But initially I'd hoped and dreamed that we would do the trek together, and I never planned to do the trek on my own because I always sort of thought it might be Sam and maybe a couple of other friends of mine, and we would go and do it as a group. And then, as my relationship started to crumble, I was so fixated on it. I was like, I'm going to do it whether anyone comes with me or not. I'm going to do it anyway, kind of thing. And that was unfortunately the way it turned out to be.
Well, the tyranny of long distance relationships is sometimes it can push you into the arms of another when your significant person is not there with you, which is what happened in your case. And you talk very candidly about being unfaithful to Sam in your book and how painful that was to go through that breakup with him knowing that circumstance and your own behaviour had kind of led to the end of that relationship, because you loved him very deeply from what I can tell from this book. In the aftermath of that though, like most people who go through a really traumatic breakup are going to go like, I don't know, drink some cocktails, maybe eat some ice cream and lay in bed. You're more determined than ever to take this time in your life to take 5 camels from Shark Bay in WA to Byron Bay in New South Wales. It's nearly 5,000 kilometres. Like, why not just like curl into a fetal position and cry your eyes out for a bit? Why is that the direction that you kept going in?
I think almost the breakup almost spurred me on even more, because I sort of thought, God, I've stuffed this one thing that I wanted and this one person that I loved so, so much. I've stuffed that up, that now I have to follow through with what I'm doing. Otherwise, it's going to have been for nothing. And so in some ways that sort of really helped to spur me on even more. And I just initially, you know, when I broke up with Sam, I'd sort of had this naivety. I sort of thought, oh, maybe we just need a break. Maybe it's all sort of become too much and maybe I just need to go and do my camel trek and hopefully he's there when I come back from it. But yeah, I really just knew like it was sort of this perfect time in my life. I felt then once I wasn't with Sam, it sort of opened up this, well, I don't have a sort of big career that I'm pursuing. I don't have a partner. I don't have kids. I'm in my early 30s and I thought, now is the time. If I'm ever going to do a long adventure, which I knew it would be, I knew it would take at least, I thought originally it would take at least a year. And so I thought, yeah, this is when I need to do it.
So you've decided you're going to do it, but you don't have camels yet. Explain how you found your camels and met your camels and got them ready to go on this insanely long walk.
So I'd gone out to Uluru and my boss, Chris Hill, he mustered these camels from the wild for his tours. So Chris said, we're going to go out camel mustering. Maybe we'll be able to get you 1 or 2 for your trek from this muster. But it was sort of a bit hazy. Anyway, we went out and it's this sort of Wild West kind of deal. We're out on one of the stations just near Uluru and we went out in this low sort of Mad Max style buggy and there's, you know, motorbikes and 4-wheel drives and you're fanging through the spinifex, dodging ant mounds to go find these camels out in the bush. And then when you find them, you're slowly, you know, bringing them back towards a set of yards to capture these camels. And so it was actually over 2 days. We brought in about 90 or so wild camels into the yard. And I mean, I would have taken every single one of them. They look beautiful to me, but Chris knew what he liked from camels. I guess he knew the right age and the right size, the right temperament as you were sort of moving them through the yards. And so he picked out a bunch from there and then they came back to Uluru, to the yards and to the tour operation there. And slowly Chris sort of started to be like, well, I don't really need all of these camels. You can have that one if you like. Oh, you can have that one if you like. And so I sort of ended up somehow just acquiring them. And I sort of got what I was given, which were all fantastic camels and, of course, also different too. So I ended up with my 5 and I actually only really took 5 because I thought originally I was going to go with more people. I thought, you know, I'd hope that Sam would come. I hoped that friends would come or, you know, and then once Sam was out of the picture, I'd sort of hoped that friends might join me on the way. So I almost in some ways took more than what I needed for the trek. But once I had them, I was attached to those 5 and, yeah, they became my team.
So you get to know their personalities and you spend heaps of time with them, training them, because obviously when you take any animal out of the wild, it's not going to immediately allow you to attach it to a rope and just walk across the country, right? So what goes into actually training them to carry all of your, you know, supplies and to walk in a nice line and to not just bolt off every 5 minutes?
Absolutely, huge amount. It's never a fast process with camels, and you cannot rush a camel. They hate being rushed. Yeah, so it took me about a year to train them.
God, that must be so frustrating though.
Oh, yeah. They're big teachers of patience, that's for sure. Absolutely. But, one of the first things I did, is like I said, I used to wheel in the treats for them, and I tried to sort of get them a little bit more used to me coming in with food and so on. You have a whole series of things, they've got to wear halters. They've never worn halters. They've got to learn to have a rope around their neck, to learn to be tied up. Probably one of the most important things is to teach a camel to hush. And so hush means to sit down. So that's a natural camel behaviour. They sit down naturally, but if you teach them to do that on command, then you can put a saddle on them, because camels are so bloody tall that you can't saddle them standing. So they always have to sit down in order for you to put anything onto their backs. So that's a really important one. And like you said, it's not just a natural thing for them. They've never walked in a straight line together. And so I have this memory of and I think I found the photo the other day of the first time that I had walked them all out in a line, and then I'd sat them all down one by one as if I was about to sort of unsaddle them. Because that took me forever. It was like you'd sit one down, the other one would stand up, and then, that one would sit down, then another one would stand up, and they're all linked together with ropes. So they're all sort of pulling each other up, down, as they're sort of going up and down. And when they finally all sat down in this straight line, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And it's such a basic thing, to anyone from an outside perspective, it would look like the most simple thing, but they're learning all of this. So it was a year's worth of training, but then it's always sort of like, how long is a piece of string? It's a continuous thing. So, and I was probably a little bit naive to this too. So the camels that I set off with at the beginning, really in reality, they were still half wild. They were very, very fresh. And even though I'd trained as much as I could, it was still all very new to them. And I was totally naive to how nuts that was going to make the whole experience of the first part of the trip.
Well, one of my favourite things about your book is the many times you have to add to the list what camels are scared of and what they're not scared of. It is hilarious that they can be scared of a bit of flapping something in the breeze, but like a gunshot, totally fine.
I will never understand it. Still to this day, I still will not get what goes through a camel's head.
It's an interesting beginning to your journey, because you want to go from WA to New South Wales, and you do manage to cart your camels over there and get ready. But this is April 2020, and March 2020, as we all know, is the start of the COVID pandemic. So you are literally, you've gotten over the border, which none of us were allowed to do for a year or more after that, and to start your trek. Was it a last minute rush, or did this all just fall into place for you and then COVID just kind of happened around it?
The latter. It was totally unprecedented how, for everyone around the world, how this would all unfold. So when I trucked the camels into Western Australia, it was sort of, I call it the toilet paper war era. It was when people were no one was really taking it that seriously. Everyone was sort of laughing at the fact that, everyone was scrambling over last rolls of toilet paper. And I don't think anyone sort of really thought that it was going to be as, much of a huge event as it was. And so we arrived in Western Australia, and it was only, I think, a week, if not two, after which that it was like, whoa, this is actually serious. And then they started shutting the country borders, and they started shutting state borders. Then even Western Australia even started shutting regional borders too. So it was about a week or so before I set off that all happened. And in some ways I couldn't have been in a better spot at a better time. I somehow sort of magically timed it perfectly. Although, when I was first over there, I thought, oh no, how is this going to affect me? Am I going to be able to go? Am I going to have to call it off? But I was, in the end, going to conduct my own form of isolation. So I was actually the only one able to travel in this, unique period in history, really.
Well, you never had to fight anyone for toilet paper or get dirty looked at if you coughed in the middle of the outback by yourself. So you did.
No.
You did avoid quite a few awful things.
All of that.
So you set off from the beach in WA and start walking. I mean, from Shark Bay heading into the interior of Western Australia, it's not long until you're in some pretty trying territory. What was it like when you first started on this trip because you've got half wild camels who you've only just trained. You're just trying to figure out how to balance all your supplies on them and, you know, make sure they have enough to eat as they're going on this journey too. How was that first week to month heading into the WA interior?
It was exhausting. I think looking back on it, it was the hardest month of the whole trip that I did. And I was totally unprepared for it. I mean, I guess I always knew that there would be a little bit of a sort of, you know, getting used to it, steep learning curve period, but I had never anticipated it sort of going on for that long and it being that hard. And it was sort of several factors. Yeah, it was very remote. I felt very away. You know, I didn't really know many people in WA. I'd never been to WA before. My friend Greg had driven over in the truck with me, so he was about the only person I sort of really knew over there, plus, you know, the station owner. So it felt very isolated, and it was isolated as well. You know, north of Perth, the population is completely sparse. And I was travelling across big stations, a lot of which were abandoned, so I wasn't going through any homesteads. I was seeing barely any people. And I was doing it all in a very bad year, drought-wise. So it was sort of the tail end of a really long drought there. So the feed on the ground for the camels was terrible. And that really then added to the fact that they wanted to go wandering, of course, because they wanted to go look for more feed. And so it was this combination of them wanting to take off and go wandering, and then they were also really nervous. They were terrified of everything. And so I then spent hours every time I got to camp trailing them through the bush before bringing them back to camp. And it was disorientating, the bush too. It was very flat. It was very monotonous. It was very shrubby, so you couldn't see out. Yeah, it was the whole thing was tough. It was hot. The flies were horrendous. It was hell. That first couple of weeks was seriously, I was kind of like, what have I got myself in for? Like, this is not the romantic camel trek that I guess I had, you know, envisioned and longed for.
Was there ever a moment you thought, stuff it, I'm going to chuck it in?
Never really. And you know why? It was actually because the logistics of getting out of the situation were probably almost just as hard as staying in the situation.
It's easier to walk to Byron Bay than get someone to come and pick you up.
You know, it would have meant still having to walk back somewhere with the camels. It would have meant having to get them back on a truck them back somewhere. It was kind of like I was so deep in this whole thing that I had to always keep going. And, you know, obviously there was a determination there. Like, I don't think I ever thought that I would give up. But I also didn't realise how hard it was going to be.
I think the beauty of your book is reading your descriptions of what Australia is really like out there, because not huge amounts of people have been to the places that you have been. Some stations have only seen handfuls of people maybe through those places over, you know, decades and decades. But the way you describe the country as you're moving through it, and it does change quite dramatically. You expect kind of the interior of Australia just to look kind of a bit the same. Are there parts of that journey through the really tough middle centre, especially when you get to the real desert part of it, that you would say is like one of the most beautiful places in Australia?
It also changes so much in terms of time-wise. You know, a place that is so beautiful at one particular time might then experience 4 years or 5 years or 7 years of drought and look terrible, you know, to someone else at another particular time. You know, I've had people contact me that have read the book, and I've described the Flinders, and they said, oh, that's not my experience of the Flinders Ranges. It was really green when we went up there. And I was like, well, it wasn't when I was there. So, yeah, it's such a moving sort of thing, the outback. And it changes so quickly. Everyone sort of thinks of it as this very static thing, and it really isn't. I think for me, I definitely remember, and it's sort of fast forwarding a little bit here. It was actually after the Great Victoria Desert. It was in the Strzelecki Desert. I had been following Strzelecki Creek, and I came out of Strzelecki Creek, and it was just this sea of amazing wildflowers. It was yellow and white and green. The dunes were sort of covered in these bright green succulent, and it looks like these just rolling green hills covered in flowers, sort of nothing like what you imagine the desert to look like. And I've actually, since finishing the trip, driven through that exact part of the desert, And it doesn't look at all like that at the moment. The flowers are gone, you know. So, yeah, I was very lucky, you know, to see it at that time. And that is the beauty, I think, of the camel trekking, is that you're walking at such a slow pace that, yeah, you get to see these little hidden nooks of the country at these certain particular times, and you really get to see, I always say, like, the beauty of the outback is in the detail, and that's what you really get to see when you walk the country.
Coming up after the break, what happened when Sophie trekked across the country during the middle of COVID lockdowns, and the remarkable story of how she found love again in the middle of a desert.
The one thing that actually did worry you and scare you at times was the one thing that you were also in love with, and that was other camels.
Yeah, that was definitely probably the most nerve-wracking thing going into the Great Victoria Desert. I was pretty aware of the fact, I mean, if anyone's seen Tracks, the film about Robin Davidson, it's probably the most memorable thing, I think, to people that stands out is her having to shoot wild camels. And I'd spoken to other people that had done other camel treks too, and so I knew it was very much a case of not whether I would have to shoot any, but sort of how many. So I had rifles ready to go for this, and I knew it was inevitable, but it was still very nerve-wracking.
That must be hard for you, though, to kill an animal that you're so endeared with.
Yeah, absolutely. It was never an easy thing. And I probably justified it in a way because camels in Australia are a feral species, and although I love them dearly, many of the station owners out there would shoot wild camels, and I knew that because they're classed as a pest and they create grazing pressure on the ecosystem. So it's actually sort of a legislation that you have to shoot wild camels on your property. So I'd seen lots of shot dead camels along the way. So I knew it wasn't like I was killing an animal that was, you know, endangered or, you know, a native. And I mean, of course that, you know, it doesn't make the reality of it any easier. But, you know, the other thing I knew is that it was us or them. My camels could be in danger from wild bull camels coming into camp, and I had to protect my herd. So that was sort of, I guess, my rationale behind it. But still, yeah, incredibly tough, and it had to be done. And I was so focused on doing it properly and the most humane and quick way that I could do it, it became almost like business-like in my head. And I was surprised at how actually, you know, rational I was and how not little emotion I had, but it was just, okay, these are the steps you've got to go through to kill this camel and to kill it properly and fast. And so, you know, I was so in that mindset that the emotion almost didn't come into it till sort of probably a lot later.
Well, the other scary creature out in the desert is other people. And as much as you wouldn't presume you'd come across that many, I was actually really surprised at how many people, and I mean, not just people that you knew were going to be there, like people who were, you know, at the homesteads or, you know, who are rangers who would spend time out in that area, but also like just random, like there's one night you explained that you were at some little hut and like a carload of random young dudes rock in, blaring, you know, music. And immediately...
that was particularly unexpected.
Oh, my God. Well, immediately my brain goes to, oh, no, she's in danger here. Like, this is a group of men who are finding you by yourself out in the outback. Like, what could be worse? They make movies about stuff like this, right? But your experiences with these people is so amazing.
And isn't that funny? Isn't that funny that is the way that our brain naturally goes? And people have such this idea with the outback that, you know, there's so many movies made like Wolf Creek and, you know, Snowtown and, oh God, you know, so many other ones, you know, that gives us this perception that like everyone in the outback is creepy and out to get you. This night when I had all these guys turn up, and it was in some ways, it did used to make me nervous. It was, I'd spend so long by myself that it was like I'd almost turn into a prey animal myself in a way. Like I was very on edge if something new happened, or, you know, when I was walking there was so little stimulus, so that people turning up with blaring music was sort of almost a bit of a shock to the system. these young dudes rolled in and proceeded to basically have a party around me. And yeah, at first I was sort of, I don't know about this, but I've never think the worst of people. I always tend to think the best of people. And whether that has always attracted good things, I don't know. So I'd never really thought anything bad was going to happen with these guys. They were sort of loud and hooliganish, and they were obviously there on sort of a boys' hunting trip. And they asked, if I wanted to come and have dinner with them. And so I did. And actually, I had all of my jerry cans. So I had about 12 jerry cans that needed to be filled up. And I was just thinking, this is going to be a real pain in the ass, because I'd camped a little bit away from where the water point was. It was a hand pump. It was, going to take ages to fill all the jerry cans up. And I thought, then I'm going to have to lug them back. And, carrying 2 fully loaded jerry cans, that's about 40 kilos, it's a struggle. I'm not, super huge or super strong, and that was a struggle for me to move all of those. And I had gone out to get the camels and left all my jerry cans empty at camp, thinking I'd do that the next morning. And then when I came back to camp, I actually found that all the jerry cans were full. The boys had taken them over to the water point. They'd filled each of them for me and brought them back to my camp. And then, were basically handing beers to me and were like, come and have a steak with us. So, it was totally unexpected. And, and that was my experience really along a lot of the trip, that, I learned very much to never judge a book by its cover.
What I love too is there's so many stories like this throughout the book of people you come across, expected and unexpectedly, but walking through Maralinga lands and meeting the traditional owners of that area and hearing their stories and almost being welcomed in and knowing that permission's been given for you to go through areas that sometimes people are not allowed to go into because there might be secret men's business or there might be sacred sites there. What did that mean to you to be given permission by the people whose land and whose country that is to walk through it?
Yeah, it was really special. And I actually realised sort of quite early on that it was going to be quite different with the Oak Valley community, because I had to apply for permits to go through Aboriginal land. And I remember when I applied for, a lot of them went through government organisations, and I never heard anything back. I had the permit, but, it was never any sort of personal contact. And when I applied for the permit to travel through Maralinga lands, I actually got an email back from them saying, look, we just want to know that you are carrying enough food. We want to know that you're carrying enough water. We want to know your emergency contacts and so on. And I thought, well, they actually really care. So I went back to them with all that information, and they were straight away like, that's great. No worries. You can travel through our lands. So yeah, really early on, it was this, relationship and this feeling like they actually were keeping tabs of what was happening on their lands, and they actually cared. And yeah, so much of it, I didn't actually realize I was going to travel through this area of secret men's business until I was almost there. And then I realized that, I've got about 40K or something like that I had to go through. And it said on the side of the track, it said no camping. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to camp because it's too far for me to go. And yeah, and I realised when I met the rangers that there had been all of this discussion behind my back about whether that was going to be okay for me to do that, and they'd all agreed and everything. So yeah, it's amazing, their relationship to land and how much they still are looking after all of these sacred sites out there. And it was just a glimpse into that ancient culture, but that was magical to have that glimpse.
Well, you talk through that journey of people who drive hundreds of kilometres just to drop off a bale of hay or some water or something to you because they've grown to care about you and make sure that you're okay. You're into South Australia and, you're getting through to the Flinders, and you've realised at this point that you're not going to make it in the time frame that you thought you were going to make it in, so you're having to reassess and take a break over the summer months because walking through a desert in the middle of summer is not the best idea. So you have to stop down for 6 months. But right before that happens, you meet someone more unexpected on this journey. Tell me about Jimmy.
Yeah, well, that was, I was never expecting to meet anyone on my journey. I'd sort of, I don't know, I'd make jokes probably to friends and whinged about it to friends. Oh, how will I ever, after breaking up with Sam, how will I ever meet anyone doing what I'm doing, traipsing around in the middle of the bush, with camels. Then I took this summer break and I had the camels adjusted in the Flinders Ranges, and I knew of a little bakery in the area, and I thought, oh, well, I've just been 3 months out in the desert. I'm going to take myself on this nice little coffee date. So I went to the bakery on my own for coffee, and it's a tiny little town, only about 50 people. So, of course, I stood out as an outsider, and a guy called Jimmy served me. And I remember thinking, it sort of took me off guard because I hadn't really sort of met anyone my own age, anyone that was sort of good looking or anything. And he was just super friendly from the get-go. He was very enthusiastic and very friendly. And it started like that. And then I went back to the station where the camels were adjusted, and that's where I was staying before travelling back to Brisbane for the summer. And Jimmy knew the people that care took the station. So he had said when I left him at the bakery, he said, oh, say hi to Paul and Karen. I thought, okay, well, I guess he's really good friends with them. So the next thing you know, I'm sitting on the station and Jimmy turns up totally unannounced. And I thought, oh, well, I guess he does this all the time. I guess he always, drives down to see Paul and Karen on the station. I found out much later that he'd actually never visited Beltana Station. He'd never just dropped by in this way. So it was clearly absolutely with the intention of coming to see me. And we started, a friendship, and it was nice, I guess. It was really nice to have someone in the area that was my own age. Jimmy sort of had an interesting story as well, in that he had been born in Tassie, he'd grown up in Melbourne, and then he'd moved to the outback in his kind of early 20s. So he sort of wasn't from the outback originally. So, both of us could chat about all these things that we sort of thought was funny, about stuff that people said out here, or that, the main topics of conversation being the weather, or, the sort of farm chat of like sheep and, cows and everything. And both of us could sort of like pretend that we were part of this world that we actually, hadn't grown up in. And I liked that. And then before you know it, he was driving thousands of kilometres when I started the second part of my trip. He was driving thousands of kilometres to come see me.
It's funny though, in your book you said you read some news stories about your trek as you kind of got towards that latter part of it, and they started to mention that, Jimmy was with you and he was part of it, and there's a part of you that feels protective of doing this on your own and showing that you are an independent person and can walk from one side of the country to the other. Where did that come from, that moment where you don't want to share this experience with anyone else?
It was funny because I had always thought that I would share the experience with Sam or with friends. And then once that wasn't no longer a possibility, then I'd really sort of seized hold of the idea that this was my trip. And this was a way of me discovering my own strength, finding out what I was made of, doing it alone. And that really became one of the most empowering things about my trek. And so then I was really sort of clasping hold of this still when Jimmy came into the picture. And I was torn. I was torn between the fact that he was offering to help, and it was so lovely to sort of, even though I'd had so much help from people along the way, it was sort of, I was then all of a sudden getting help from someone who was familiar, who was coming back continuously. So he got to know the camels. He got to know the way that we did the trek. He was the perfect helper in that way because he knew our routine. And so it was sort of like I was starting to allow him to help me. And it almost like with the camels in a way, it became a little bit of, they were such a huge responsibility. It was like being a single parent almost with these animals. And then it was, once Jimmy came on the scene, it was sort of like co-parenting, which sounds silly, but then there was also this real feeling in me of like, now that I'm doing this trip on my own, this is what I needed to do. This is what obviously this trip meant to me. And I don't want to give up that independence because I felt for the first time that I was learning to be on my own, learning to do everything on my own, learning how capable I was on my own. And that was absolutely so precious that then I didn't want that taken away. Because, people would meet us on the second half of our journey. It might happen to be when Jimmy was there, because it often was, because it was when we would go into a town and Jimmy would have come. He would have driven to visit me in that particular town. And then he would drive back to the Flinders Ranges, back to South Australia to carry on working. And I would then walk again for another couple of weeks on my own. So it was like frustrating, because it was like no one saw all of this alone time that I was doing. All they saw was Jimmy and I as an item, and Jimmy and I doing things together as a team. It frustrated me because it wasn't the full picture what people were seeing.
I love that in part of your book, you're like, if this guy's going to love me, he has to love my camels. Like, if he doesn't get my camels, then like this is not going to happen, right? But he does.
It's not going to work.
But he does. And then eventually you realise that, hang on, maybe at least one of my camels likes him more than me. How did that feel?
Yeah, I still think, Delilah definitely likes Jimmy more than me. And Jimmy started sort of turning up to see me, and he'd be like, "Oh, how are my girls?" And I was like, who are you coming to see, Delilah or me? But yeah, it's interesting. Camels will always have an affinity, with one person maybe more than another. And Jimmy will describe it like Delilah and I we have a great working relationship where we're very polite in the office with one another, but we'd probably never go out for drinks after work. Whereas Jimmy will go up to her and give her a big cuddle, and she seems to just absolutely love that. She's always sort of, what's your attention when I try and do that? But no, it was great. Like the fact that Jimmy was developing that sort of relationship with the camels, I guess made me love him even more. He knew all of their idiosyncrasies, and it was like finally I could share that with someone. Finally I could share those, look at that funny look that Mac's doing, or like this funny thing that Delilah did, or so on. And he knew that because he knew their personalities so well.
You walk on in to Byron Bay. You've walked for like 4,000 something ridiculous kilometres. What does it feel like to come to the end of that? Was there grief that it was over? Were you happy? Were you relieved? What did that feel like?
I think the grief actually in some ways came a little earlier. I think I started to realise sort of probably a little bit around the corner country after Cameron Corner that we were coming out of the sand dunes and that we were coming out of the desert country, and there was a certain these dunes that had once, terrified me in the Great Victoria Desert, then I sort of grew to love them, and then I suddenly realised that, we're about to sort of cross our last bunch of dunes and that's it for the trip. So there was a real sadness there, and then there was also sort of another real sadness when I realised it was the last night I was going to be, spending on my own. Yeah, because I had organised then, at this point, I had organised Jimmy to come and to walk with me and to kind of be my support crew, because I knew that I would need that coming into Byron. So the trip had changed so much by the time we got to Byron. It was sort of no longer what I was doing the trip for. I did the trip in a way to be out in the wilderness, out in these remote places alone with my animals. And coming towards the East Coast, it was then no longer that. So, yeah, in some ways the trip had already ended, I guess, in my mind. But then my goal was to make it to the shores of the Pacific Ocean, so that was part of it too. And I knew I still had to get to the end. And, yeah, then it became very, very chaotic, and almost the real end snuck up on me a little bit. The ocean itself and the arriving at the ocean itself, it sort of snuck up on me because I became so focused in the last probably 2 weeks before the beach in getting the camels through the traffic. It became this huge logistical operation with Jimmy walking out ahead of me and my friend Kieran tailing us in my ute, and basically Jimmy and Kieran working together with UHFs and navigating traffic all around me as I just plodded along. So when I saw the ocean for the first time, it kind of shocked me. I'd got so used to compartmentalizing and to just like, you know, taking every day at a time and just focusing on where I was at, that it was like, oh shit, we're actually there. And yeah, and then I think just at that moment, as I saw the ocean, then we had to like navigate one more bit of a main road down the Byron Hills there, and Jude started having an absolute freak out with the truck coming. So I was like, okay, we're not at the beach yet. I've got to focus again on what I'm doing with these big animals in a very busy place.
So you did it. Well done. You walked from one side of the country to the other, which is an incredible feat. To do it with 5 ginormous animals who are constantly needing to be chased around the desert is incredible. But you get to the other end, and what happens now? Like, I'm sure everyone has asked you, like, what do you do after that? How do you even replicate an adventure like that in your life? What do you do now that you've done the thing that no one else has ever done in their lives? So, like, you, obviously, I'm talking to you, you're in South Australia right now. You and Jimmy are still together, which is wonderful. Everyone obviously wants to know, where are the camels? And do you plan on doing something as insane as walking from one side of Australia to the other again?
Oh, look, there's always other adventures to be had. I'm sure I can come up with some crazy thing, walking yaks from this side of the Himalayas to the other. I don't know. So, yeah, I'm in South Australia. Jimmy and I are still together, and the camels they're on a station called Depot Springs Station, which is only half an hour away from where we live. So it was fantastic to have the opportunity to take them out there. And the Flinders has got to be some of the best country for camels. It's dry here. There's lots of bush called prickly acacia, which they absolutely love. So Jimmy and I probably go out to see them every week, if not every second week. We just go out and we give them carrots to the camels. And yeah, so really it's only been, this is the second year since I completed my trek. So last year I just sort of thought, you know what, they deserve a big fat holiday. So they have just sat in that paddock mainly, just eating themselves silly. They're looking pretty obese now, to be honest. All of their saddles need to be adjusted. I would love to take them out on a walk again, but yeah, all of their saddles need to be changed because their humps have got even more ginormous. And so this is the problem with an animal, that you put the saddle on the one thing that changes in size is that actually like their saddles have to be cut and re-welded wider to be able to take in that bigger hump, which is great. It's a great problem to have. And I think in terms of camel trekking, I think I'm very much done with taking the camels to the East Coast. It was a fantastic experience and fantastic to be able to show them to people over there and everything. But like I said, you know, it's tricky camel country. They really love the dry. When they got back to the Flinders here, the first thing they did was just rolled and rolled and rolled. They love that fine bull dust that they can get in their coats, and they were just so happy to have that again. And yeah, so I'm really keen to explore more deserts. I loved going through the Great Victoria Desert and the Strzelecki Desert. So it's now sort of become a bit of a goal. We have 10 deserts in Australia, and I would really love to explore each of them with my camels. I mean, the beauty is with camels is that you can as well you don't have to follow a track. You can go cross country. So you can just go up and over dunes, whichever direction you like. So yeah, doing a bit more of that, a little bit more sort of cross country off the track stuff, and maybe combining it with, I don't know, a bit more ecology stuff, and looking, you know, being able to go to places in the desert that you can't reach via 4-wheel drive, and looking at how I can give back with what I do in that way with the camels. So yeah, it's a bit hazy in my mind still, and we're still, you know, still working it out. But I'm definitely, having been under a roof and in a bed for a couple of years now, I'm definitely starting to crave being back out there in the slag and under the stars and walking with my big animals.
Well, if there's one thing, we're very jealous that you basically skipped the entire pandemic by walking across the country. And
super convenient.
very convenient for you. However, I think I'll stick to being one of those awful tourists that you describe in your book who carry everything, including the kitchen sink, when they go out into the outback. There's no way I'm doing it the way that you did it, but it's an incredible feat. Congratulations. The book is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these incredible stories with us. And there's so many more in this book. The people are amazing. The country is amazing, and your camels are amazing. And I don't know what you see in them, but I'm glad that you love them. Thank you for sharing with us today, Sophie. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Claire. It's been great chatting to you.
You can find Sophie's book, The Crossing, via the links in the show notes. This episode was produced by Emmeline Peterson. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline, Joannou, and Sophie was interviewed by Claire Murphy, host of our daily news podcast, The Quickie. If you enjoyed this episode and want unlimited access to the subscriber-only episodes, we would so appreciate if you would support us by becoming a Mamamia subscriber. Just click on the link in the show notes. You'll get extra episodes of No Filter and lots of other things. I'm Mia Friedman. Thank you for having us in your ears.